Yep.
That's the comfortable position that we've
Yes.
arrived at, is that in the minds of conservatives, the only people who die of this are
Yeah.
weak and old and
Yeah.
deserving of being weeded out.
Mhm.
We were too kind to them to begin with, basically.
Right.
And that's a position that's easy for conservatives to adopt. It's one that they've always sort of wanted to take anyway. And then for liberals, you have a very similar situation where the only people dying of this are now, in their minds, the ugliest version of like a Trump supporter that they can like conjure up. And they've kind of always wanted to imagine those people dying of their disbelief in science anyway, right? And so
Yeah.
so both sides have sort of arrived at an interpretation of the pandemic that tickles their sort of baser
Right.
instinct, and that is going to be a situation that's very hard for us to escape from
Yeah.
without just continuing to stack bodies. And it's always
Yeah.
been, or it's a situation that seems, in retrospect, almost inevitable.
As long as there was going to be, like, a large portion of the population that was unvaccinated, as we were kind of referencing earlier, there was always going to be a ton of room for variants to evolve and potentially become more effective at, you know, beating the immunity, the protection that, these vaccines provide.
More than a self-consciousness about giving boosters while most of the world doesn't have a first shot, is that they didn't want to give that kind of forecast to the market. This is what we should expect the future to look like, I think. Myopic institutions that are so betrothed to keeping the economy spinning that they're not even really aware they're running public health policy in the name of small business owners and the sweatshops that they operate.
Going into rural Arkansas, into a gas station or something like that, when this was in the height of, of itself before vaccines were a thing. And then I go up, to Illinois for Thanksgiving, and you know, God, no one in Central Illinois is wearing a mask.
Yep.
So it's not just some like stereotype we can throw at the South. It's This is just major pandemic fatigue among many, 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 many Americans, and
The only like political interpretation to this is that our political institutions and the parties themselves are, you know, incapable fundamentally of doing anything other than exactly what they've done,
yeah,
which is, fail to create a robust safety net, and fail to set public policy in the interests of anyone other than capital
yeah.
and corporations and business owners.
The fallout that we have seen from this pandemic is not necessarily indicative or as a result of who is in the White House. It's these are
Mhm.
broader indictments of capitalism and just how unstable the system has always been. And it just took this one thing to kind of like reveal the really immense and deep cracks in American society. That's so concerning to me for the future and other topics that we discuss on this show. And I just can't help but worry about how are we going to react to other potential existential crises that occur. Whether that's through climate change, whether that's through, disclosure, whatever. I don't know how people are going to react to this stuff.
You talk about the timing of it, and to me, what you're sort of bearing down on here is the overdetermined contradiction that kind of sits at the center of this phase of global post-industrial capitalism, which is that capital has to draw the world into ever increasing interconnectedness, right? That it
Mhm.
has to connect and homogenize in order to access and profit from new markets and frontiers. And that very act of interconnection is what drives us to the point of global pandemic. And the only way for the power structure as it's vested right now to persist is to not just maintain those structures, but keep them running as close to 100% all the time as possible.
Right.
And
Right.
we can't scale back, right? Scaling back isn't an option because we must be constantly driving this process of interconnection and ever greater production and profitability. And that is increasingly, it's not just that drives public health crisis and global pandemic, but that's what
Yeah.
drives global warming. That's what
Mhm.
drives the economic immiseration of,
Yeah.
the laboring class. These are at the core of the challenges that we face as a society right now, and they are overdetermined contradictions.
Oh, yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
if you remove any one variable from these structures, it wouldn't change their broader direction, right?
Yeah.
If you did some sort of reform in one country, it wouldn't significantly alter these things.
Right. I don't know. And again, this goes back to the timing of it, and I think this is just a result of our decisions, in the post-industrial, well, industrial and post-industrial world, that have led us to this, you know, the crossroads of where we're going as a species, and, um I mean, this is it. I mean, I think that's kind of what we're getting at on this show. I think a little bit is that the 21st century is like this is the end game for like where we go from here, and it's at least in terms of the climate for one thing, the clock has run out. The clock has seriously run out on our ability to prevent catastrophic damage.
I think to observe that is not to say that it was always this inevitable. I think this is the most frustrating thing about sort of what you're pointing out is that we have squandered 200 years of industrialization, 200 years of relatively democratic standards in human society, especially compared to human history more broadly. And we have done nothing but destroy ourselves. And the event horizon for sealing that fate was frustratingly recent,
Mhm.
and that
Oh,
something
yeah.
might have been done in the very frustratingly near past to save us from this overdetermined
Yeah.
place of decline.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. No, this is going to be a sunny one, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Um, the New York Times obtained Pentagon records recently about 1,300 civilian casualties of US drone warfare going back across the last decade. As much as we, sort of appreciate and value, this investigative journalism, it is coming, sort of out of the same hellmouth that birthed this world, right? That birthed this type of conflict.
Yeah.
That as we've always pointed out on this show, we see our arbiters of authoritative knowledge in this society as very, very much responsible for where we are today.
Sure.
And among those is, our institutions like the New York Times, who are responsible for creating the cultural and informational climate of that birthed these policies.
Mhm.
And because of that complicity, because we usually start from a position of acknowledging that when we talk about this topic, it becomes readily apparent that the New York Times, has an objective here. And
Oh yeah.
the first thing that they have to do at the top of this series is provide cover for the Obama administration.
So the first part in this series, we have a little bit of a quote here. The air campaign represents a fundamental transformation of warfare that took shape in the final years of the Obama administration, amid the deepening unpopularity of the forever wars that had claimed more than 6,000 American service members. The United States traded many of its boots on the ground for an arsenal of aircraft, directed by controllers sitting at computers, often thousands of miles away. President Barack Obama called it, quote, the most precise air campaign in history, end quote.
So let's take the sort of most basic component of this. It says that they took shape in the final years of the Obama administration. And I want to make it really clear, we were debating targeted killings in high school during Obama's first term. And the New York Times article kind of goes on to sort of admit this, that this has been something that's been very much underway since the 90s. Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American citizen, was killed in 2011, 13 months before Obama won re-election. The intelligence community can't pretend at this point that this isn't a significant piece of U.S. civilian casualties, right? It's detailed in this article that that's sort of what has kind of driven investigation even internally in the past is this
Yeah,
observation that this is a significant portion of the folks we kill with our military are just
yeah,
civilians who get caught in the crossfire, and this runs counter to this perception we're meant to have of drone warfare, which is that it's incredibly precise, which is how it was communicated by the Obama administration. And so this is the thing that can put the lie to it. And it's so hard to observe because of the range of things that we're gonna kind of talk about here in a second. And we're gonna talk about kind of the like euphemisms that are used to kind of cover the actual realities of how civilians come to be executed by the American military. And that I'm deeply kind of suspicious of the sourcing on this story, who leaked all these documents, because it seems to me that there are factions within the state who have wanted to see this addressed, right?
sure.
Who have tried to draw this out, and the only way for them to do it, and the only way for them to sort of convince um, their superiors to participate in this, for US Central Command to literally give comment to the New York Times on it, is if they thought it was necessary to hang this information out there and kind of have a disclosure and a conversation about it, right, that mostly was just an opportunity for them to reiterate their positions that these things are unfortunate, unavoidable, and uncommon.
Yeah. So the article goes on. The documents, along with the Times' ground reporting, illustrate the many, often disastrous ways the military's predictions of the peril to civilians turn out to be wrong. Their lessons are rarely learned. These breakdowns of intelligence and surveillance occur again and again. Repeatedly, the documents point to the psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias, the tendency to search for and interpret information in a way that confirms a pre existing belief. People streaming toward a fresh bombing site was assumed to be ISIS fighters, not civilian rescuers. Often, the danger to civilians is lost in the cultural gulf separating American soldiers and the local populace. No civilian presence was detected when, in fact, families were sleeping through the days of the Ramadan fast, sheltering inside against the midsummer swelter, or gathering in a single house for protection when the fighting intensified.
Right. And let's be really clear what we mean by confirmation bias. We have military officers who sit in a room with air conditioning and pensions and healthcare benefits, and they receive surveillance footage corroborating an intelligence brief. And it doesn't really matter what the footage contains. Bureaucratic due diligence is all that's necessary to create a liminal space to murder civilians. And this is the process that the military's propagandists refer to when they adopt a somber tone and pretend that they do their best to avoid executing innocent people. Confirmation bias is a euphemism, a patina of cover for the reality that we are gods of the strategic zone and we get to decide who lives and who dies. That's confirmation bias. It's that there's no way for humans in that room to do anything other than rain death down from the sky.
The article continues, in many cases, civilians were visible in surveillance footage, but their presence was either not observed by analysts or was not noted in the communications before a strike. In chat logs accompanying some assessments, soldiers can sound as if they are playing video games, in one case, expressing glee over getting to fire in an area ostensibly poppin' with ISIS fighters, without spotting the children in their midst. Military officials often speak of their over the horizon long range surveillance capabilities, but the documents repeatedly identified deficiencies in the quality and quantity of the video footage guiding intelligence. Sometimes, only seconds worth of footage was taken before strike, hardly enough to assess civilians' presence. Officials often describe these as awful but inescapable accidents. But while many might have been averted through additional precautions, widening the surveillance camera's field of view or deploying additional drones, the phenomenon continued unabated amid the intense pace of battle and a shortage of surveillance aircraft.
We've articulated this in the past that drone warfare is supposed to be more precise and less deadly to civilians than its conventional alternative. This is the premise that is used to defend this concept under a framework of just war theory. Though conventional warfare may be more destructive to civilian lives, and certainly
Yeah.
more destructive to the lives of the aggressing military, drone warfare's collateral damage is occurring to people who are completely unaware that they're living in a combat zone.
Hmm.
And the people who are caught in it have no opportunity to take cover or precautions. And oftentimes are resting in their homes or
Just out on the street, or doing whatever.
going to the site of a bombing to try to provide medical aid.
Yeah.
It's conspicuous that that would be the tactic because it's so obviously a justifiable animosity in the hearts and minds of civilians, people who might otherwise be disengaged. And at a certain point, when these tactics persist, you have to wonder whether or not that isn't their purpose.
The thing that I want to address on this episode is an article that came out in the New Republic. Um, they published a wholly uninformed hit piece on the passage of the Gillibrand Amendment UFO office. So on December 14th, they published an article titled Congress is about to send the Pentagon on a wild flying saucer chase.
Flying hyphen saucer.
There's no need for a fucking dash between flying and saucer in the title, so we're already off to a bad start here. So I want to get into why the article is absolute nonsense and why there is a complete lack of awareness by some of these outlets that are, not really grasping the gravity of like what's been occurring with the UFO mystery.
Well, and I wanted to go ahead and give a little bit of context on Jason Colavito as well, who is the person who wrote this piece for the New Republic. And Colavito just put out a book through the Indiana University Press, and it's one of these books that's sort of very like didactic and academic about like dispelling myths about the pyramids. And so Colabito has sort of an interest in portraying this segment as utterly irrational because there have been so many people in this, because Colavito makes his money off of, saying, "Oh, look at these crazy people who believe these things about the pyramids."
Yeah,
And so it's in much the same way that characters like Neil deGrasse Tyson or whatever, have an interest in doing, sort of a similar interpretive act.
right, right.
Colavito is here, the author of The Legends of the Pyramids, which came out just this past year.
Yeah. We should give an overview of what he is referencing for those who are kind of unaware. So,
Right.
the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2022 was just passed. And as we have ideological differences with things being passed in that legislation, but
Three
buried,
quarters of a trillion dollars for the
yes,
Pentagon.
going to the military while a SARS pandemic rages on. So it's um $28 million of the legislation goes for nuclear weapons. A provision requiring women to sign up for the selective service was removed. A decent chunk of change, $7.1 billion, was devoted to deterring China, and that legislation directs President Biden to create a grand strategy with respect to China,
Oh, good.
whatever the hell that means. And another $4 billion was authorized for the European Deterrence Initiative, which is meant to discourage Russian aggression in Europe. So we're spending $4 billion to tell Mr. Putin no.
Well, and
That's
can I like deterrence is one of my favorite terminologies in the American intelligence community lexicon. And because deterrence it once reveals that there are no existential threats, right?
mm-hmm.
Like first and foremost, that like the deterrence is the height of what the Intelcom will really say is a danger to the United States. Deterrence. I
Yeah,
mean, Iran's nuclear program, deterrence, right?
right.
North Korea's nuclear program, deterrence, and so when you so there's that side of it, but then when you see it in this context, like deterring
It's
China,
a yeah,
deterring Russia,
it's a
deterrence is being used there to describe entrenching an imperial system on the other side of the world.
it's doing that, and it's also acting as sort of a PR spin to lessen the scariness of
Right.
like that for like the American
It's
public too.
defensive. It's
Right.
defensive.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're just deterring.
Yeah. Exactly.
Even though deterrence is also the scariest word we can use to describe what our enemies are trying to do to us. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
Um,
All right. So that's a lot of the legislation in a nutshell. And buried in this legislation was a amendment for the creation of a hopefully transparent UFO office in the Pentagon. So there was news recently, just to kind of I'm going to sort of juxtapose this. This is a totally separate office from the other one that was just created by the Pentagon, not through Congress, called the Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group, or AOI MSG, which is just terrible as it comes off the tongue. And so this group, there was sort of recent criticism toward the Pentagon that they just decided to create this new office that doesn't really have any sort of transparency,
and it's about what synchronizing messaging,
conspicuously at the same time that the Gillibrand amendment UFO office was being discussed in Congress.
right?
And so they said, "Oh no, it has nothing to do with that." But anyone with any sort of critical thinking skills can
Right.
realize that this is
This is
the
the organ for aligning the
yeah,
congressional side with the position of the intelligence community.
we saw very much the same sort of thing when Project Blue Book was around. Project Blue Book was like was the 1950s 1960s version of this Gillibrand Amendment UFO office that's going to start up next year. But the criticism with Blue Book at the time was that it was basically just a large PR operation to completely debunk the mystery that was going on
Right.
at the time, while the real substantial research was going on away from the public eye.
Right.
And I think Jacques Vallée has talked about he stumbled across a memo, a it may have been a classified memo, basically talking about how like there we have Blue Book here, and then there's an unnamed program that is away from public eye that is studying the phenomenon
Mhm.
basically. And that's in that was dated either in the 50s or the 60s, and who knows where that program is now, whether
So
it's been.
why then does um, Colavito say that no one in the government has tried hard to disprove these types of accounts, even though we have
Yeah.
actual decades and in
Yes.
some cases very intentional groups being
Hmm.
created specifically to disprove these things,
Yeah.
yet they persist. Why did Jason Colavito write that the report that failed to explain more than 140 reports of unidentified flying objects, quote, was mostly because no one in government tried all that hard to explain them, end quote.
So I think there's a couple options here, basically, for like what's going on with Mr. Colavito. So he's either completely unaware of the history, um, or I think option number two is he is aware of the history, yet is consciously sort of making the decision to not address it.
To sell his book in a topic
Yeah,
that nobody's actually discovered anything new in
right.
decades.
Or number three, he is very much under the influence of the still sort of resistant PR initiative to dispel this
Right.
as a
Well,
serious
and
issue.
there's an attempt in here to disparage Elizondo and Mellon.
It's interesting too. At the end of this first paragraph, he goes, underneath the surface, Congress is about to require the Pentagon to get weird. Very weird, like imaginary crash saucer wreckage weird. And I just want to say that like there is increasingly that the United States government for decades has been in possession of exotic technology that has been recovered. Um, Ross Coulthart has publicly said at this point that he without a doubt believes that through his own defense sources believes that we've recovered exotic non-human technology, and have been in possession of it for a long time. And for those of you who are unaware, Ross Coulthart is an investigative Australian journalist with serious
Yep,
credentials.
he's won about everything there is to win over there.
Yeah. And has worked for 60 Minutes, and has a book out right now called In Plain Sight that everyone should read. And so, not just that, I mean, we have Christopher Mellon on the record basically saying that he's talked to high level, intelligence and defense sources, that people believe, that something extremely real and exotic crashed in Roswell. And another article that I want to kind of talk about in conjunction here to sort of dispel this thing that Colavito has said, over on Trail of the Saucers, which is a Medium blog written by Bryce Zabel. So Bryce actually, Mr. Zabel has a podcast now with Ross Coulthart called Need to Know, and he wrote a article titled "The Roswell UFO Crash is on Fast Track to Disclosure." So he writes, July 2022 will mark the 75th anniversary of the Roswell crash and retrieval operation. After more than 7 decades, with hundreds of witnesses all telling essentially the same story of the wreckage and cover up, it's time to admit the Roswell case is more likely than not a true story about a crashed vehicle. The witnesses tell a powerfully consistent story that what came down violently in the New Mexico desert in 1947, was not made by the United States or any other foreign power. That doesn't mean we can say exactly who we came into contact with that day, only that it wasn't us. The case has been heavily classified since it was stuffed away into secrecy immediately after a press release and global coverage of a recovered flying disc. The long term cover up has been protected by twin pillars of denial and ridicule. Um, the idea that crash wreckage exists is actively being talked about by former government insiders like Harry Reid, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, investigative journalists Leslie Keane, George Knapp, Ralph Blumenthal, Jacques Vallée, Ross Coulthart, and many others. If the US has multiple vehicles in its possession, as is openly stated by some, it's not much of a stretch to think that Roswell will turn out to be the original sin of the cover up. So, for those who are kind of unaware of like the story of Roswell, basically, it's kind of this legend in American culture at this point that's taken on, it's taken on sort of
A mythic quality.
a mythic quality that I think, is has been muddied basically by, decades of misinformation and disinformation. So in July of 1947, Mac Brazel, a rancher, discovered a collection of strange debris scattered across his employer's land southeast of Corona, New Mexico. So first thing here, the incident did not take place in Roswell. It happened outside of it in a smaller town. Roswell was just the nearest place with a news outlet and
Place
the
on a
a
map.
military base. Right, exactly. Um, he drove some of it into town primarily to complain to the local army base, thinking they had crashed one of their secret planes. So one of the first to investigate was Major Jesse Marcel, who at the time was an intelligence officer. Knew immediately there was, this was not military property, but something stranger. So basically, the Air Force comes out there, and then an entire, wreckage retrieval operation happens. And so the Roswell Daily Record runs, their front page headline: the local Air Force captures flying saucer on a ranch in Roswell region. No details of flying disc are revealed. So, like, Jesse Marcel basically, is publicly part of this sort of operation, saying, here, we've recovered a disc. And then the next day, this statement was completely retracted, and Marcel goes out in front of the media holding what is wreckage of a weather balloon. Zabel in this article talks about this basically, and then very brilliantly kind of puts here at the end of this article several quotes from like very reputable individuals. Ross Coulthart, as I mentioned earlier, said, "I'm absolutely certain that the United States government has recovered non-human technology that is not of this world, and that that technology includes craft. I'm in a position now to be reasonably sure from my sources that's the case." Christopher Mellon said, "I've been told by multiple people who have scientific and military credentials and access that they believe Roswell as an off-world crash is true." Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, said, "Make no mistake, Roswell happened. I've seen secret files which show the government knew about it but decided not to tell the public." Major General Kenner Hertford, deputy commander of the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, says, "I'm completely convinced that the object that crashed near Roswell was composed of materials not common on Earth." Brigadier General Arthur E. Exon, the United States Air Force, former base commander of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is a very significant location in UFO lore.
Well, and in the story of
They,
Roswell.
in the story of Roswell, says they knew that they had something new in their hands. The metal and material was unknown to anyone I talked to. The overall consensus was that the pieces were from space. Uh, Major General Barry Goldwater, former Arizona senator, 1964 Republican presidential nominee, said, "There is not much we can do about Roswell. I tried diligently to get the files from General LeMay, and it was only cussing out he ever gave me."
So Colavito writes, quote, "It's beyond doubt that people see strange things in the sky. It's also quite likely that there is no single explanation for these oddities. So-called unidentified aerial phenomenon, as the government now calls UFOs, are likely a combination of natural and human-made objects, along with a strong dash of people misinterpreting what they see under the influence of more than a century of alien-themed science fiction.
Yeah.
Investigating the individual military sightings should be encouraged. Uncovering whether some of these perhaps represent adversaries' efforts to spy on America should be an obvious counterintelligence step. That doesn't justify leaping to conclusions about superhuman technology or alien invasion, particularly when reasonable explanations have been proposed for nearly all of the allegedly incredible sightings." End quote.
Mhm.
That's a nothing position. You could just as easily say that same thing and support the ODNI. We have all of this sort of clear evidence that Colabito is broadly just a dilettante in this subject, and demonstrates that flawlessly, and then
Yeah.
turns around and just says like the same thing Marco Rubio would say to try to
Mhm.
encourage people to vote in favor of this. And it's
Right.
just like I don't know. I guess maybe if the Intelcom had actually been paying for this, they would have gotten somebody a little better.
Those who are in favor of disclosure and getting this information out to the American public I think have to realize that like there is a lot of work still to be done against the resistance that we're getting from individuals like this, who, kind of as we sort of addressed earlier, are either just uninformed, are informed, or are making a deliberate effort, to continue to prevent this stuff from getting out to the American public.
This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPod and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.